All right, everyone. We're jumping back into our live internet studies with the topic in front of us, which is the Eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events. And we're still in topic 5, which is the book of Daniel and the 70 weeks of Daniel. And my goal tonight, in this first hour long, is to actually finish the kind of the overview of Daniel 9, 24, 25, 26, and 27, all 4 verses there, and then to even maybe begin zeroing in on the final 70th week within the set of the time frame that Daniel recorded for us. But we have to kind of work our way through those other verses first. So we've already looked basically using Pastor Guzik's notes. We've already looked at verse 24 and 25. And now we're ready to start looking at 26. Let me just kind of show you the passages and read them all for you. Here's verse 24. 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Verse 25. So you're to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there'll be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Verse 26, which is the one we're going to start looking at tonight. Then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the Prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end, there will be war, desolations are determined. And then if we can get to it, if we can finish verse 26 and 27 and start looking at 27 more intently, it reads, and he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. This is what we call the 70th week of Daniel, or the final 7 period. Right? Remember the word week there is just the word shavua, the root word shavua in the Hebrew. I'll just show it to you real quick. It is right there. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Let's try that one more time. That word right there, shavua, which is a heptad. It's just a generic word for 7. Without context, you wouldn't know what amount of 7s it's talking about. But since within Daniel we've determined that we're talking about weeks of years or heptads of years, then it's a 7-year, not a 7-day or a 7-month or even a 7 something else, right? It's the context really demands that we're talking about. I say demands because when we're looking at the events as a whole and what time period it would take to transpire and get all of these events to happen, then we must be dealing with a 7-year time period. Plus, something else that a good friend of mine and I were discussing before the class started is that within this 7-year period, and we're going to see this when we get to it, within this heptad, the reason we know it must be years is because elsewhere, not just in the book of Daniel, but elsewhere in the Bible, we have the midpoint week that Daniel's talking about here, where it says, and he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 heptad, 1 7. But in the middle of the heptad, or the middle of the 7, right, same Hebrew word, in the middle of this week, which we know to be a week of years. Why? Because the midpoint, which would neatly divide the 7 into 3.5 and 3.5, that time frame is spoken of elsewhere in the Bible. 3.5 years, 42 months, 1,260 days. And so thus we know, using language in its most normative sense of years, months, and days, we know that this must be a 7-year time frame that we're talking about. So, verse 27, he'll make this firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction. One that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate. And that's the end of Daniel's prophecy. And as I mentioned, my goal is to finish 26 and start looking at 27 tonight. I don't think we'll finish 27 tonight because there's so much there that I don't want to rush it. Even though this isn't a deep dive into the book of Daniel, the details that are here aren't given there are some details that are found just in these short 4 verses that aren't found in other places in the Bible. For instance, the word 70 weeks and things like that. And so it's worth stopping and going slow enough to make sure that we're grasping how this is going to impact our look at the book of Revelation, which is what we're really working towards. Okay, so those are the verses in view. Daniel 9:25 is going to be looked at in a few different versions here. In fact, if I show you on the screen now, some of the different versions, let me shrink that just a little bit. There we go. We got the NIV, verse 25 here. I'm sorry, we don't want verse 25. Why do I have that verse? Give me a second. We want verse 26. There we go. Had the wrong verse pulled up. So verse 26 here, NIV, after 62 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death and have nothing. The only thing I want you to see is the very first few words in some of these different versions. The NLT, after this period of 62 sets of 7. English Standard, after the 62 weeks. By the way, ESV says, after the 62 weeks, an anointed one. It doesn't say the Messiah. It doesn't say the anointed one, which is consistent with the Hebrew, which doesn't have a definite article in front of the word for anointed one. It's an arthrous, meaning it's missing the article. So an interpretation like the ESV or the Jewish publication versions that don't have it as saying the Messiah or the Christ, that's consistent with the Hebrew, which lacks the article. Although it's not wrong to say the Messiah if that's your interpretive understanding of who the individual is that's going to be cut off and have nothing, which I believe is Messiah, Yeshua. Berean Standard Bible, then after 62 weeks. Notice I'm not reading the whole verse. I'm just showing you the first few words because that's the part that it's the time frames that get a lot of mileage in the discussions of interpretations. Well, my version is right, your version is wrong. The Jewish version is more accurate than the Christian version. The Jehovah's Witness version is more accurate than the Christian version. You know, depending on which interpretation you're looking at, it's going to drive your perspective. After 62 weeks, the good old-fashioned KJV there. 62 weeks, the New King James cleans it up. NASB, then after the 62 weeks, NASB 95, 62 weeks, NASB 97, 62 weeks. Legacy Standard, 62 weeks. Amplified Bible, 62 weeks. Christian Standard, 62. Holman Christian puts the number 62 in there. Doesn't write it out. ASV, 62 weeks. Reads like an old KJV. So does the Aramaic Plain Bible. 62 weeks there. Brenton Septuagint says after the 62 weeks, the anointed one. We'll look at the Septuagint in time and see if the Greek actually is, if the Greek allows for us to have the anointed as opposed to an anointed, because Greek has a definite article that shows up. In fact, maybe I'll do it later on tonight, but I don't want to do it right now. But just be aware that that's there. Contemporary English version at the end of the 62 weeks, Dewey Rames after 62 weeks, ERV after the 62 weeks, God's Word translation, but after the 62 sets of 7 time periods, that's an interesting translation, Good News translation, and at the end of that time. Notice, God's Word translation, Good News translation, more of a paraphrase, I understand, rather than a dynamic equivalent like, say, King James version or something like that. This is more paraphrastic, so it's paraphrasing. And notice they just smooth over or take out any time frame altogether. And at the end of that time, they don't even mention the numbers, or that 62 weeks, or how everyone's got their own particular way of saying, well, is this 62 sevens? Is it 62 years? Is it 62 years of sevens? Is it 483 years? Is it 490 years? Is it 462? There are different interpretations, and that's why I'm showing it. And we kind of focused on that last week, so that's why I'm alerting it to your attention, bringing it to your attention, alerting you to it. International Standard, and then after the 62 weeks, JPS Tanakh, and after the 62 weeks. A modern version, I think, doesn't use that ancient, archaic 60 language, but notice, after the 62 weeks shall an anointed one be cut off. We already know that the JPS, which is short for Jewish Publication Society, we already know well, we Christians know well, that Judaism rejects Jesus as the candidate, as this anointed one who would be cut off at this particular time frame. Instead, they opt for someone like a king, an anointed king, either Agrippa, who lived in the first century, or Herod, or maybe even one of the Roman emperors would be considered an anointed one, a king, a ruler. They're just taking the word anointed one here, the Hebrew word Mashiach, which is normally used in context of a king or a priest, someone who's anointed for a particular office. And they're simply saying this is just some recognized leader. It doesn't have to be the Messiah. It's simply a leader, a Messiah, a messianic leader. In that sense, messianic being the generic form of the word for leader. That's the way they're spinning that translation. Literal standard after the 62 periods of 7. Majority standard after the 62 weeks. Notice that most of the English-leaning Christian translations have the word Mashiach, the Hebrew word, which is translated as Messiah. They have it capitalized with a capital M. Why? Because their interpretive bias is that this must be Jesus. Thus, not only is it the word Messiah instead of an anointed one, but two other features. They'll usually have the article, the word the, even though it's not there in the Hebrew, and also they will put the Messiah, the word Messiah with a capital M, meaning for them this is the Christ, this is Jesus. New American Standard after the 62 weeks, an anointed one. So it reads almost like reads more like a non-Christian version. The Net Bible after the 62 weeks, an anointed one. New Revised Standard Version after the 62 weeks, an anointed one. New Heart English Bible, never heard of some of these, right? After the 62 weeks, the Messiah. Webster's Bible Translation, after 62 weeks, shall Messiah, with the capital M. World English Bible, 62 weeks, and the Anointed One. Kind of a mashing up between the word anointed instead of Messiah, but it's with a capital A and a capital O, and it has the definite article, right? Young's Literal, after the 62 weeks, after the 60 and 2 weeks, cut off is Messiah with a capital M. And there's additional translations that I don't really need to look at the moment. But I think you guys are getting the idea that Daniel 9:26, which we're going to be looking at tonight, has a variety of different translations. But something that seems to be rather almost universally agreed upon in all of the versions that we read is that the 62 sevens transpires or goes by, and then something happens to this Messiah figure that's cut off, because they all begin with more or less after the 62 sevens, this anointed person is cut off. So that's where we get a lot of agreement. Wouldn't you? Did you take notice of that? We talked last week also about this idea of confirmation bias. Just wanted to remind you again of how this works. Confirmation bias in its negative form is the tendency to search for, interpret, and remember information that confirms our beliefs. And because of that, then we can have facts and evidence that our beliefs may blind us to. So using the two circles, you can see that on the far left, we have an arrow pointing to the part of facts and evidence that shows that we discredit and ignore certain facts. And yet at the same time, on the far right, the opposite, we have an arrow pointing to what we want to be true of our beliefs. And in that overlap section in the middle of this Venn diagram, right in the middle of that kind of almond slice, right there, smack dab in the middle where the arrow's pointing down, what we look for and recall when you talk with people about what do they understand about the Bible, and they remember what they've heard in church or what they've heard in synagogue or what their favorite YouTuber talked about, and what they look for when they're reading their own Bible themselves, it's that very small slice of the confirmation bias. And again, in the negative form, this can have the tendency to blind us to perhaps really what the true details are, because we're only seeing what we want to see based on what we perceive is in agreement with what we already believe anyway. It's kind of what we might call self-confirming, right? Oh yeah, I knew that was true because I already believed it to begin with. I knew that was it was going to be that way because I already believed it, something to that effect. And yet, that is something that we want to make sure we're avoiding in the negative sense of the word when we're reading the Bible. It can give us a false sense of knowledge, right? Because we're not really seeing objectively what the Bible's saying. We're only seeing what we believe we want to say. And yet at the same time, when we're talking about prophecies that have been fulfilled or facts that have been revealed from the time period of the Tanakh carrying over into the New Testament, such as who is the Messiah? Is he the one that we've been waiting for, right? Speaking of Israel and her blindness, then there's a biblical form of confirmation bias that I believe actually can work to our advantage, where we're allowing the older parts of Scripture to confirm earlier parts of what we might call partial information or limited information or even mystery. We know that the Bible is a progressive book, and God laid out information from beginning to end in progressive fashion. He didn't reveal everything all at once. And so as time unfolded in history, and as mankind received more and more revelation from God, some of it was veiled in mystery, some of it was partially revealed, but not all of it was revealed. The time period of the New Testament is the revealing of God's truth in its fullest sense, as is demonstrated in the coming of his Son, the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, the establishment of his people, right, the body of Messiah, etc., etc. The mysteries are being unfolded before us, even though some of the mysteries are still mysterious, right? We only have as much information as God gives. But the point I'm trying to highlight in this confirmation bias recap is that we can now use biblical confirmation bias to say, well, there were Old Testament prophecies that we weren't quite certain about, but because the New Testament has now filled in the missing details, and now that we have fulfillment of some of these details, we can now look at history and say, the Bible now confirms what was only foretold in the Old Testament, in the time period of Tanakh, and we have a healthy version of confirmation bias. We already looked at how that the weeks are really years based on the context, not just by what must be taking place in the time frame, but also because of the standard Hebraic understanding of a week referring to a year and its relation to both the Shemitah sabbatical year, as well as that's relation to the larger Jubilee or Yovel year. So we looked at that in time, and we don't need to rehash that anymore. We're right now in the middle of looking at Daniel's 70th week, and tonight we're going to turn directly into looking at verse 26. Looking at this time chart, we've got the breakdown of the three separate periods that Daniel himself speaks of. The first period of the 7 weeks, the 49 years, followed by the second period of the 432 years or 62 weeks, which, using simple math, leaves us with the final 1 week or 7 years. And I believe that that perspective, that context, drives the interpretation that most people arrive at when we say that there are three periods that we're speaking of that are working together. 7 plus 62 plus 7. And when we say 7, I mean 49 plus 434 plus 7. That's what I mean by those time frames. Look at the math here. It must add up. We can have discussions on whether or not there truly is a church age gap between the first two chunks of sevens and the final chunk. There's some differences of agreement there. Yes, I understand. And there are different ways to interpret who and when the decrees start, right? This particular graphic shows that it started at around 444. There are others who take an earlier date, 457, some who go even far earlier than that. But most Christian organizations agree on either the 457 or the 444 date as the starting point. Judaism itself has some allowance for that starting date. But we talked about how that this person who shows up after the 7 weeks, this Messiah figure that shows up according to some translations, if he shows up after the 7 weeks, the first 49 years, then it's much too early to be Jesus. And that's why Judaism takes that particular perspective. So let's begin to continue. Let's begin to look at particularly verse 26 and work our way through I don't know if he's a doctor or not, but Pastor David Guzik. His commentary is available online at enduringword.com. Very, very highly recommended Bible commentary. He takes the traditional kind of what am I going to say? The majority perspective on Daniel's 70 weeks here, which sounds very dispensational. I myself am not a dispensationalist, but when there are truths that a certain denominational group or a certain perspective brings to the table that I agree with, then I take that part of that discussion and I latch onto it, right? I'm fine with saying that the way the dispensationalists describe much of the time frames seems to be accurate to me. So I'm going to go with this particular interpretation on many of these details. We have some minor disagreements, but I'll highlight those whenever I see them. So here's Pastor David Guzik. Point number 4 in the outline that we're working through. What happens after the first 69 weeks, which is really the zeroing in of the point of discussion for tonight? Let's read the verse again. And after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off. Right up front, his translation, whatever he's using, I can't remember, I think it's NASB as well. Right up front, he has the word Messiah with a capital M, and thus, from his perspective, this Messiah must be Jesus. Let me show you this in the Hebrew just real quick. V'achrei ha-shavuim, shishim, ushnaim, right? Those are after the 69 weeks and after the 69 weeks itself. Yikaret Mashiach. Yikaret is the verb for shall be cut off. And then the next word, let me just highlight it for you so you can see what I'm talking about. This word, Mashiach, is where we get our English word Messiah. And if you can read Hebrew, you'll notice that there is no article. It doesn't say HaMashiach shall be cut off, right? Yikaret HaMashiach. It literally says Messiah. So if your translation has the Messiah, that's one thing. Let me real quick, I didn't have this before, but I'm just curious. Let's bring in the Greek Septuagint and see what the Greek says. Bear with me. I should have had this pulled up earlier, but I didn't. 926. The Greek says the Greek does not have a definite article in front of the word Messiah, or the what word we would translate as anointed one, Chrisma, which is right there. But it doesn't have ha Chrisma or tas Chrisma or some other form of a Greek article like we see elsewhere in this verse. There's a Greek article there, tain. There's ta here. There's tas up here. There's toe over here. These are the Greek articles. The word the that we would translate. There's toe right there. You can see where I'm moving my mouse right now. But in front of this word chrisma, which is the word for anointed one, there's no article in front of it. So even though the translation below it in English has the anointed one, over on the right side it simply says an anointed one. That's a little more close to what it literally says. So, alrighty. So now we know again why. If you hear someone arguing, well, this isn't Jesus, it doesn't say the Messiah, it says an anointed one. It says a Messiah, right? Well, we have to be fair now with the translation. You're right, it doesn't say the Messiah as if it's the Christ that we've been looking for. But context drives what our interpretation from a Christian perspective as well as a Jewish perspective. So after the 62 weeks, Messiah doesn't say or the, just leaves it out altogether, but it's capitalized, and that tips your hand into knowing that, hey, this is a Christian translation. Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself, also capitalized, the H there in himself. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with a flood. Until the end of the war, desolations are determined. Okay, let's read Guzik's translations, or his commentary. Point A, after the 60 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off. The biblical term cut off is sometimes used to describe execution, right, per Genesis and Exodus. Gabriel told Daniel that the Messiah will be cut off for the sake of others, not for himself. Yes, the word yikaret is the word karat, is the root word, is normally reserved for execution of people, right, being cut off or excommunicated from within the group. Sometimes God can say to an Israelite, if you do X amount of commandment breaking, you'll be cut off from your people. Doesn't mean that you will die. I mean, you won't be executed, in that fashion. It's not a capital punishment pronouncement. Rather, you are kicked out of the group. You're excommunicated from the people group of Israel. You're kicked out of the town or the city or the land, or et cetera, depending on the context. But it can and does refer to execution in other passages.